Hello everyone, if you love touching animal stories and want to follow the inspiring journey of these adorable friends, don't forget to hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss any of our videos. Now, let's dive into today's emotional story. In the heart of a small, quiet town, a peaceful afternoon was shattered by the roar of roaring motorcycles. The sun was shining, casting a warm glow over the town square, where the locals sat on benches, enjoying the calm of their day. The streets were serene, with a few children playing and elderly neighbors chatting. It was the kind of town where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened, and that's exactly what Rick Crusher Dalton, the leader of a rough biker gang, was counting on. Rick was a towering man with a thick beard and a swagger that made everyone around him uneasy. His leather jacket and dark sunglasses completed the look of someone who demanded attention, and he enjoyed every second of it. Rick loved the power his gang gave him, an aura of dominance, respect, and fear from others. That was how he thrived, by proving that no one was tougher than him. On that particular day, the gang had rolled into town on their roaring bikes, looking for a little trouble, a way to entertain themselves. As they pulled into the center of town and parked in front of a cozy cafe, the locals couldn't help but notice them. Heads turned, whispers spread, and a few people quickly looked away, hoping the bikers would pass by without incident. The peace of the town was disturbed, but Rick wasn't concerned about that. He liked the attention. With a smirk on his face, he dismounted his bike and scanned the scene. His gaze landed on a pair of dogs sitting quietly near the entrance of the cafe. A golden retriever and a Doberman, both well-groomed and poised, watched the world go by. The golden retriever had the gentlest eyes, while the Doberman stood tall and alert, proud of its stature. To Rick, they looked like a couple of pampered pets, living a life of luxury in comparison to his rough-and-tumble lifestyle. "Look at these fancy pets," Rick chuckled, nudging one of his gang members. "Must be living better than us, huh?" His friends snickered, and one of them muttered, "Yeah, probably don't even know what real fun is." Rick grinned. He loved showing off in front of his friends, and he quickly decided to make a joke out of the situation. Without a second thought, he raised his boot and gave the golden retriever a light kick in the side, not hard enough to cause real harm, but enough to startle the dog. The retriever let out a surprised yelp and stumbled back, confusion and fear in its eyes. The Doberman immediately rose to its feet, standing guard over the frightened dog. The quiet cafe turned tense. The townsfolk gasped. A waitress dropped her tray, her hands shaking as she looked at the scene. A child sitting at a nearby table squeezed his ice cream cone so hard that it splattered to the ground. The whole town seemed to freeze in place. Rick laughed, pleased with himself. His gang chuckled along, unsure whether they should be laughing too. One of them nervously muttered, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. But Rick didn't care. "It's just a dog," he scoffed. What's the big deal? What Rick didn't realize, however, was that his joke had just crossed a line. Those two dogs weren't just any pets. They belonged to a man who had a reputation for more than just his fame. Jason Taylor, a quiet, reserved man sitting inside the cafe, had been watching the entire thing unfold. Jason had been enjoying a simple cup of tea, appreciating the serenity of the town. But when he heard his golden retriever's yelp, everything changed. He looked outside, his eyes narrowing as he saw the biker, Rick, laughing like it was just another prank. But what Rick didn't know was that Jason wasn't just an ordinary man. Jason had spent years in combat training, honing skills that turned him into a force to be reckoned with. And the man who had kicked his dog was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The cafe owner, an elderly man with soft eyes, saw the look on Jason's face and knew exactly what was coming. He quickly approached Jason and whispered, "Sir, I think that biker just made a huge mistake." Jason didn't answer. He didn't need to. His calm demeanor spoke volumes. Slowly, he placed his cup back onto the saucer with a soft clink, stood up, and walked toward the door. The people in the cafe exchanged nervous glances. They knew who Jason was, even though they had never met him before. His reputation, both on screen and off, was legendary. Jason Taylor was known for his ability to handle intense situations with a calmness and discipline that few could match. But what Jason was about to do wasn't about fame. It was about justice, and he was about to teach Rick a lesson he would never forget. As Jason stepped toward the door, the atmosphere in the small town shifted. The once peaceful afternoon now felt tense, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Rick stood tall, arms crossed, a smirk still plastered on his face, trying to project his usual tough guy bravado. But there was something different about the way Jason carried himself. The town, which had been filled with calm and quiet, now seemed to freeze, and even Rick's gang began to feel a sense of unease. Rick's friends, who had been laughing and cheering him on just moments before, were now strangely silent. They watched as Jason, walking calmly and deliberately, closed the distance between them. The slow, measured rhythm of Jason's footsteps on the pavement echoed in the tense silence, drawing everyone's attention. Even the most confident of the bikers couldn't help but feel that something was off. Rick, still trying to maintain his composure, glanced around at his gang. But the usual mocking glances and chuckles were gone. Instead, the air seemed thick with something they couldn't quite place, a sense of anticipation. Jason's approach was not hurried. His pace was deliberate, measured, and it was this calmness that unnerved Rick the most. It wasn't that Jason was rushing to take him down. No, Jason wasn't acting like he was about to throw punches. He was simply walking toward Rick as if he had all the time in the world, as if he were simply going about his business. But Rick could feel the pressure mounting. There was no need for Jason to shout, to act like he was angry. His very presence was enough to make Rick's smirk start to fade. The bikers, who had been used to bullying their way through towns and making their presence felt, were now beginning to feel the weight of the situation. They had never been in a situation where the power dynamic had shifted so easily, so suddenly. The people in the town, who had once been cowering and avoiding eye contact, now stood up straighter, almost as if they were watching a show unfold before them. Rick could feel the eyes of the town upon him, the weight of their gaze making him feel smaller. Jason stopped just a few feet in front of Rick, his eyes never leaving him. The few steps Jason had taken had completely changed the scene. It was as if the world around them had faded, and the only thing that mattered now was the confrontation standing before them. Rick, trying to regain control of the situation, cleared his throat. "What's the deal, mate?" he asked, his voice not as confident as it had been before. "It was just a dog, right? A little tap, nothing serious." Jason's gaze didn't waver. He stood still, his body relaxed, but there was something about his presence that made Rick feel uncomfortable. "You kicked my dog," Jason said, his voice calm but heavy, like a storm about to break. Rick's smirk faltered. "It was just a joke," he said, trying to brush it off with a nervous laugh. "No need to get all worked up over it. Just some fun." But Jason's eyes remained fixed on him, unwavering, and Rick suddenly realized something. This wasn't going to be like any other encounter he had had. Jason wasn't trying to show off, wasn't trying to prove he was tough. He didn't need to. Rick was now feeling the weight of his own actions. Jason took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Rick's. It was a simple motion, but it sent a chill through Rick. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a creeping feeling of uncertainty. He had been in countless fights before, had stared down many people, but this was different. Jason was not like the others. He wasn't rushing in with anger, but rather with calm, calculated precision, and that made Rick feel uneasy. "Think it's funny?" Jason asked, his voice still steady. "Let's have some fun, then." Before Rick could react, Jason made his move. It was quick, too quick for Rick to even process. One moment, Rick was standing tall, trying to regain his composure, and the next moment, he was stumbling backward. Jason hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't even needed to. With a simple movement, he had swept Rick's leg out from under him, and Rick found himself crashing to the ground with a loud thud. The sound of Rick hitting the pavement echoed through the quiet street, and for the first time that day, his gang didn't laugh. They stood frozen, staring in disbelief at their leader lying in the dirt. The townspeople, who had been watching from a distance, now couldn't hide their smiles. Some of them even whispered to each other, exchanging knowing glances. They had just witnessed something they'd never forget. Rick scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had never been knocked down so easily, especially not in front of his gang. His men, who had always followed him without question, now looked uncertain. One of them hesitated, glancing nervously at the scene unfolding before them. Rick, however, wasn't going to back down. His pride wouldn't allow it. Jason didn't move. He stood still, his expression unchanged, watching Rick struggle to rise. "Not so funny now, is it?" he said quietly. Rick clenched his fists, still trying to shake off the shock. His pride screamed at him to do something, to fight back. But deep down, he knew he had just made a grave mistake. This wasn't a fight he could win. Rick's heart raced as he stood up, brushing the dust off his clothes. His pride was shattered, but he wasn't about to let it show. The pain in his wrist from the sudden takedown still throbbed, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to focus. He had been knocked down once, but that didn't mean he was out. Rick wasn't going to let Jason Statham, of all people, make a fool of him. Not in front of his gang, not in front of the entire town. His gang remained silent, unsure of what to do. Their leader, the one they followed without question, had been humbled by a single move from this stranger. Rick's men exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty now faltering as they watched their fearless leader stand there, clearly shaken. The town, on the other hand, was still, the tension palpable in the air. It was clear to everyone that Rick had underestimated the man before him. Rick clenched his fists, his face burning with embarrassment. "All right, tough guy," he growled, his voice strained but still trying to hold on to his bravado. "You think you can embarrass me like that and just walk away?" Jason's gaze didn't waver, and he didn't flinch at Rick's words. He stood perfectly still, his posture relaxed but radiating control. Jason's calmness only served to intensify Rick's frustration. How could he be so calm? How could he stand there like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just humiliated Rick in front of everyone? "You want to try again?" Jason asked, his voice low but clear, almost as if he were bored with the entire situation. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet, dangerous confidence. Rick didn't hesitate this time. He charged forward, hoping to catch Jason off guard. His fists flew, aiming for Jason's face. But Jason was faster, much faster than Rick had anticipated. With a swift movement, Jason sidestepped Rick's punch and grabbed his wrist in a vice-like grip. The biker leader's momentum carried him forward, but Jason twisted Rick's arm, forcing him off balance again. Before Rick could even register what happened, he was slammed into a nearby wooden table, the force of the impact sending plates and cups flying into the air. The table splintered under his weight, and Rick groaned, his chest heaving with shock and pain. The gang gasped in disbelief, their faces pale as they watched their leader crash to the ground again. For the first time, they could see the truth. Rick wasn't invincible. He wasn't the toughest guy in town. Jason had shown them that in a single, effortless movement. Rick struggled to get up, his breath ragged, but Jason was already standing over him. Jason didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His eyes were calm, almost pitying, as he looked down at Rick. "Still having fun?" Jason asked, his voice almost amused, though there was a quiet intensity behind it. Rick's pride was on the line now. He could feel it. He had to do something, anything, to regain his sense of control. He pushed himself to his feet again, his legs shaky, but determined. This time, desperation fueled him. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small pocket knife, and flicked it open with a sharp snap. The town gasped in unison, and some of the onlookers took a step back, wary of what might happen next. Jason didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he sighed and shook his head, disappointed. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Jason said, his voice steady and unbothered. Rick's grip tightened around the handle of the knife, and in a flash of motion, he lunged at Jason, hoping to catch him off guard. But Jason had already anticipated his move. Before Rick could even get close, Jason's hand shot forward, grabbing Rick's wrist in a firm grip. With a swift twist, Jason forced Rick to drop the knife onto the ground with a loud clink. Rick let out a sharp gasp, his knees buckling under the pressure as his arm twisted painfully. For a moment, Rick just stood there, staring at the ground, the knife lying useless at his feet. His wrist burned, his pride shattered, and his mind was racing. How had this happened? He was supposed to be the toughest man in this town, the one everyone feared. But now, he stood defeated, humiliated in front of his gang, the townspeople, and most of all, Jason Statham. Jason leaned in slightly, his voice low but clear. "That's how it feels to be helpless," he said, his words carrying a weight that Rick couldn't ignore. "Now imagine how my dog felt." Rick's face went pale. He had never experienced this kind of vulnerability before, especially not in front of so many people. His hands trembled as he tried to steady himself, but the feeling of helplessness washed over him. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. He wasn't just embarrassed anymore. He was afraid. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment, it felt like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Rick didn't say anything. He couldn't. His mind was spinning, and his pride, once unshakable, was now nothing more than a distant memory. Jason stepped back, releasing Rick's wrist. The sound of the knife hitting the ground echoed in the still air. Rick stood frozen, his chest heaving with frustration and defeat. Jason didn't need to say anything more. The message had been made loud and clear. As Jason turned to walk away, his golden retriever trotted up to him, its calm, intelligent eyes locking onto Rick. The dog seemed to look at Rick one last time, as if acknowledging that justice had been served. Then, with a wag of its tail, it sat beside Jason, who gently patted its head. Rick swallowed hard. He wanted to fight back, but he knew it was pointless. His gang, still in shock, slowly began to back away. One by one, they returned to their motorcycles, unsure of what to do next. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. They had seen their leader fall, and they weren't sure they could follow him anymore. The sound of the motorcycles starting up filled the air, but it wasn't the triumphant roar they had arrived with. It was the sound of defeat echoing down the empty street. As Rick climbed onto his bike, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just learned the most humbling lesson of his life. And the town, for the first time, felt safe again. As Rick and his gang slowly revved their engines, the roar of their motorcycles seemed to fade in the distance, almost like a retreating storm. The streets of the small town, which had been filled with tension just moments ago, slowly returned to their usual calm. The townspeople, who had been watching with bated breath, now began to relax, some smiling quietly to themselves, others exchanging whispers about the spectacle they had just witnessed. Jason, with his two loyal dogs by his side, stood there watching as the bikers left. He didn't need to prove anything more. His actions had already spoken for him. His calm demeanor, his controlled strength, had been enough to teach Rick and his gang the most important lesson of all. True power didn't lie in intimidation or violence. It lay in knowing when to stand firm and when to walk away. The cafe owner, who had watched the entire scene unfold, stepped forward cautiously, wiping his hands on his apron. He smiled warmly at Jason, a look of admiration in his eyes. "Well, I must say," he chuckled, shaking his head, "that was quite a show." He glanced at the street, where Rick and his gang had disappeared, still in shock. "I've seen plenty of tough guys come through here, but I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that." Jason gave a slight nod, the corners of his mouth lifting in a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Some people think strength is about showing off," he said, glancing down at his dogs, who were now sitting quietly beside him. "But real strength is knowing when to use it and when not to." The cafe owner chuckled again, this time more quietly. "I don't think they'll be coming back anytime soon. And if they do," he added, eyeing the road where Rick and his gang had just vanished, "well, they'll think twice before causing any trouble." Jason said nothing, but his slight smile spoke volumes. He patted his golden retriever gently on the head, the dog looking up at him with affectionate, trusting eyes. The Doberman stood alert beside him, ever watchful, its sharp gaze scanning the horizon to ensure the bikers didn't return. From the corner of the street, an elderly woman walked up to Jason, a kind smile on her face. "That was amazing," she said softly, looking up at him with respect. "You didn't even have to do much, and you still taught that man a lesson he won't forget." Her voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen more than her share of life's struggles. Jason looked down at her, his eyes softening. "It's not about teaching lessons," he said quietly. "It's about standing up when you need to and knowing when to walk away. Some people forget that." The elderly woman smiled, giving a small nod of understanding. "You're right," she said. "Some people forget." A small boy, who had been watching the whole exchange from behind his mother, suddenly ran forward. His curious eyes were wide as he approached Jason and gently reached out to pet the golden retriever's soft fur. "Is your dog okay?" he asked innocently, looking up at Jason. Jason crouched down to the boy's level, smiling warmly. "Yeah, he's fine," he said, rubbing the dog's ears. "Thank you for asking." The dog's tail wagged happily in response, the bond between them as evident as ever. The boy smiled up at Jason, then glanced at the Doberman. "He's really cute," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. Jason chuckled softly, standing up straight. "They both are," he agreed, his gaze flickering briefly to the Doberman, who remained ever watchful. The cafe owner, still shaking his head in disbelief, spoke up again. "I think you've earned yourself another cup of tea after that," he said with a grin, gesturing to the cafe. "It's on the house." Jason smiled, nodding in acknowledgement. "I could use another cup," he said, walking back toward the cafe, his dogs following closely beside him. The townspeople, who had been watching all this unfold, slowly began to return to their daily routines. They spoke in quiet tones to each other, some sharing their thoughts about what had just happened, others simply enjoying the calm after the storm. It was clear that they would be talking about this moment for years to come. As Jason walked back into the cafe, he glanced once more at the empty street. The sound of the motorcycles had faded completely, and the town had returned to its peaceful, unhurried pace. It had been a simple encounter, really, a moment of quiet strength in the face of aggression. But for everyone in the town, it had been a reminder of the power of composure, of knowing when to fight and when to walk away. As Jason settled back into his seat, his golden retriever by his side and the Doberman keeping watch nearby, the cafe owner returned with a fresh cup of tea. The cafe was filled with the soft hum of conversation, the normal rhythm of life in a small town restored. Rick and his gang would undoubtedly remember this day for a long time, but so would everyone else in the town. Jason hadn't just taught Rick a lesson. He had reminded the people around him of something vital. Strength didn't need to be shown off. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was simply stay calm and let your actions speak for themselves. And as Jason sipped his tea, he knew one thing for sure: the lesson had been learned. For Rick and his gang, the town, and even for himself, the power of restraint and calm was a strength that not many understood. But the ones who did carried it with them always.